Well, the story is told that a father was out on the porch deck one day with his little son. And he said to his son, look, I'm going to go down onto the lawn and I want you to climb up on the railing. We'll have some fun together. And I want you to jump and I'll catch you. So the little boy trusted his father like most little boys do. And he climbed up on the railing and his father got in position. And the boy jumped out into the air. And at the last minute, his father moved to the side and let him hit the ground. And the father then said this to the son, let that be a lesson to you, boy. Don't trust anyone. Now, I wonder how many of us have that mindset when it comes to life. We've been burned. We've been let down a few times. People have betrayed our confidences. People have abandoned us, perhaps. People have spoken ill of us. And because of that, we have chosen to adopt this posture. I don't trust anybody. You know, I think there's a lot of people in the world that are like that, and you may be among them. And the unfortunate thing about that is not only does it make relationships difficult, but we can often translate that lack of faith, that lack of trust into our relationship with God. And we know in our mind that God is faithful, and we know in our mind that God has made promises, but we think back to times in our lives and he seemed a little more quiet than we would have expected. And we're just not sure if we can really trust him, not sure that we can put our faith in him. We hedge our bets in relationships, and we hedge our bets in our relationship with God. Do you trust God? Are you a man or woman, a boy or girl of faith in God? Or have you learned to hedge your bets when it comes to God? You know, the Bible calls us time and time again to put our faith in God. Now, there's saving faith, obviously, but there's also the need for sustaining faith. Faith at the point of our salvation, but day by day, as we go through the challenges of life and we reach those barriers, those pitfalls, we need to put our faith in God, and we need to trust God, that God will not only catch us, but he has the capacity and the willingness to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles that we will experience in this life. This is the message of Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 through 16. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 through 16 is the second of a three-part emphasis dialing in on the life and household of Abraham. So last Sunday, we looked at the first of that three-part emphasis, the faith of Abraham to be willing to leave a far-off land and go and live on a piece of real estate that God had promised to his descendants. And the next time we preach from this passage, we also will be back to Abraham. But in the middle, we're going to talk about his wife, Sarah. And Sarah, while the last message was about the uncomfortable nature of faith and God's blessings, Sarah is a woman that had to trust in God to do what literally, biologically, medically was impossible. Now, I want to mention too that when we talk about Abraham, you may also know that his name used to be Abram, and Sarah, her name used to be Sarai. And in both of these changes that God made, so he made this slight change to Abraham's name, and he made this slight change to Sarai's name. In both of these situations, there's a pluralizing going on of their names. And the reason why God adds a pluralizing aspect to their names is because it was meant to foreshadow in their actual names their future role in being the founding couple of an entire nation, an entire ethnic group, if you will. So God changes their names, but they had not yet seen evidence that they were even going to have one son or one daughter, much less be the foreparents to a nation. I mean, not in a million years. If you were walking through the ancient Near East, would you identify this couple as having the potential to be the founding couple of a new nation. You would maybe go find someone that had 10 kids or 12 kids or 8 kids or whatever. But this couple would not be the couple you would have picked, and that's because they had a fertility issue. Sarah would be 90 and Abraham would be 100 when their child of promise, Isaac, finally arrived. And I think you all know enough about biology to know that that's not normal. So in Hebrews chapter 11, in response to this promise of God to overcome an impossible circumstance, to give not only an infertile couple, but an elderly couple a child, the Bible tells us, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. The first thing we learn about faith from this narrative is that by faith we stand on the promises of God. Kind of sounds like a song that we sometimes sing, standing on the promises of God. By faith we stand on the promises of God. Having received a promise from God, Sarah and Abraham are nevertheless faced with a seemingly impossible circumstance, infertility. Now, those of you that have experienced infertility know this, that it's not just a biological problem to try to overcome. It's incredibly painful. Those of you that have had a friend who perhaps has experienced some infertility know that it's not just a medical problem. It's incredibly crushing. In fact, because children are one of life's greatest pleasures, the inability to have children is one of life's greatest pains. And we know that. It's very deeply painful. It's bad enough when you're in your 20s or 30s and you discover that you have infertility, because you still might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe there's a little bit of hope. I have some years left, and maybe with some help or dietary changes or whatever, maybe God will provide us with a child. But imagine having the added problem of advanced age. Sarah was 90, and we know that back in the time of Sarah and Abraham, people lived a little bit longer. And so maybe her 90 would be our 70 or something like that. But it was still apparently a stretch, even in her era, to have a child. We know this because in Genesis 18:11, it says, the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. And what that means in our language is she had stopped ovulating. She had gone through menopause. It's just not possible. Postmenopausal women don't have babies. People that don't ovulate don't have babies. Now, bear in mind, and I want you to notice this, if we go back to the original account in Genesis 18, that even Sarah herself, when she initially received this impossible news from God, laughed. She laughed at it. Come on, it's like, are you kidding me? I'm going to have a child. I'm 90 years old. I haven't been able to have a child my entire life. Her initial faithlessness is recorded for us in Genesis 18, verses 12 through 13. So Sarah laughed to herself. It's a private laughter, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, may I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, even though she was doing this in private, out of the hearing of others, her doubt was a private matter. God says to Abraham, her spiritual leader, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? And then God follows it up with this question, which really is the question behind all acts of faithlessness. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I want you to think about that for a moment. I know you can hear it. Is anything too hard for the Lord? You understand that, the language, the words, you understand the question. But I'm curious as to whether or not you and I have the notion that there are some things that are too hard for the Lord. We would never say it out loud. People would call us out on that. We would never maybe admit it to our accountability partners or admit it in our small group or bring it up in conversation. But I'm just wondering if there's someone in this room today that has allowed that lie to take root in their own minds, that there are certain things that are evidently too hard even for God. And if we allow that lie to take root in our minds, even if it's a private lie, even if it's an unspoken lie, we are guilty of a sin called faithlessness. She had sinned by denying. She went on to sin by denying that she'd even laughed about it when she was confronted. So she has the sin of faithlessness, and then she has the sin of lying, even though God, you can't lie to God. God knows you. You can fake it till you make it with me. I can fake it till I make it with you. But listen, we cannot put anything over on God. God knows everything that goes on in our thinking. He knows our private questions, and obviously he knows our public questions. And so while last week we learned that true faith is immediate, here we learn that doubters, people who initially doubt and perhaps even try to hide their doubt and lie about their doubt, can also become people of faith. Whew, good to hear that, right? Because we've all got a little bit of Sarah going on inside of us now and again. Doubters can also become people of faith. Sarah doubted for what we would call in our language, valid scientific reasons. She doubted for valid, rational reasons. The probability of her bearing a child from a scientific, medical, rational perspective was 0. So you can't blame her for, in her humanity, trusting the science, relying upon what she knew about life, using her mind. It just seemed kind of absurd. But the thing is, doubt is sinful when and if we are doubting because we are denying God's right, his power, his capacity to overturn the laws of nature as he chooses. So a miracle, by the way, is by definition when God takes a law that he has put in place to govern the material world and hits the pause button. When God chooses to do something supernatural, it means God intervenes. He makes an exception to the rule, which doesn't violate the rule, but makes it a miracle. He makes an exception to the rule, and he does something that's abnormal. For example, resurrecting dead people. That's a miracle. Turning water into wine. That's a miracle. Touching the eyes of the blind so they can immediately see. That's a miracle. The virgin birth is a miracle. Sarah having a baby when she was 90 is a miracle. Those are miracles. There's a lot of things in life that are awesome, super cool to witness, the birth of a child. But the birth of a child is not a miracle. It's a result of the laws that God has put in place that govern human reproduction. It's super awesome, don't get me wrong. But it's not a miracle. What is a miracle is Sarah having a child in a postmenopausal state. That's a miracle. And God, every once in a while, does miracles. It's not the only way that he shows his faithfulness to us. He shows his faithfulness to us by allowing our hearts to beat yet one more beat. He shows us his blessing and his grace through his provision of our daily bread. God is active in our lives in forgiving our sin. God is always active, but sometimes he does something that is literally impossible based upon the laws of nature. And this is why doubt is so easy, because it aligns with what we know of life. It aligns with what we've seen in the past. It aligns sometimes with the science. But sometimes we need to put that aside. And even though faith is hard, we need to trust God to do the impossible. Now, fortunately, Sarah eventually displayed the faith of Abraham, who led her by example in his trust in the Lord. And so this is an ideal circumstance where now the husband and the wife are marching to the same beat. It's so much easier, by the way, if you're married, to be a person of faith if your spouse is on board. We all know that. And it's extra difficult if you are the person of faith and your spouse is a person marked by doubt. A marriage is just so much better. That's why we want to encourage couples in our church, like, walk with the Lord together, walk toward the Lord together, exercise faith together, pray together, converse together over spiritual things. Marriage is so much easier, so much better when you're both walking with and toward the Lord. And evidently, while that wasn't the case at the beginning, they eventually got there. And I would like to think that, humanly speaking, in large part, that was because Abraham was a good spiritual leader to his wife. And he helped her with God's grace to overcome her doubt. So here's the thing, brothers and sisters. If you have doubted, today's a new day. If you've been living in doubt, maybe you've been praying that the Lord would do a miracle in your own life, heal you of an incurable disease, save a family member who has no spiritual interest evidenced, overturn some atrocious act that has been committed against you, and you're kind of doubtful, but the Lord has spoken a word of truth to you, and he's made a promise to you, and yet you're still doubting it. Well, today's a new day. Today is a new day. And God has proven himself time and time again to be faithful to doing what he has promised. Contrary to her biology, so this is her circumstance, it may not be yours. Contrary to her biology, she received the power to conceive, the text says, even when she was past the age, which aligns with what we read in Genesis 18. Different words, same idea. Even when she was past the age. Because she had deemed the one who promised faithful. As I think about doubts in my own life, as I rub shoulders with members of our congregation here, I think that there are some common doubts that we probably want to verbalize. Sometimes it's just important to name them. And one of them that I've noticed in a lot of Christians is the lack of assurance of salvation. So there's a lot of people that question their salvation. Now, you should probably question your salvation if you're living in ongoing habitual unrepentant sin. That's a legit reason to question your salvation. But a lot of people are serving the Lord. They're keeping short accounts with God, but they're still not convinced that when God says in Philippians 1:6, for example, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ, they still doubt that. And they're not really sure. It's usually inside. They don't say it in church, right? Because then people label you, oh, there's the doubter. Especially bad if your name's also Thomas. But inside, it's a nagging doubt. Like, I don't know. Like, is Jesus enough? Is Jesus' work enough? This is doubt, and it needs to be crushed. It's a lie that needs to be identified and replaced with faith. And I think if I were to guess, 20% of you struggle with that at least. Second thing that people often struggle with is God going to abandon me? Is God really interested in me? I mean, I'm just one of, what are we up to now? 8 billion or something on the planet? I don't know. I don't keep track. Maybe let's say 8 billion for a round number. Is God still interested in a little old me? This little speck of dust in this sea of humanity? And they question whether God is close or whether God is a God that actually forsakes his own. How about eternal life, especially resurrection life? Am I actually going to be resurrected from the grave? And that's a miracle. Is God actually going to do that? Now, again, I think without repeating myself too often, I think it's a valid observation. I think it's a valid, legitimate observation to make that when we went through the horror of the last few years, that I would say over half of Christians demonstrated to me that they either don't believe in or haven't appropriated the truths of resurrection hope, because I saw a lot of people living in mortal fear, irrational fear of the possibility of death. Why? What in the world are we living in fear of death for? I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, I believe creedally, I'll sign the doctrinal statement, I believe in resurrection life. But if death scares you to the point that you start to act irrationally, I'm sorry to say you don't actually believe it. You're doubting it. Or you're certainly not appropriating it, living it out, applying its truth. So these are common. I know Christians, I'm thinking of one right now that's probably been following the Lord for some 60 years. And when I talk to them, they're always terrified of the pending reality of their death. Why? Why would you fear death if you believe in the resurrection that God has promised us? Well, the singular solution to all of these common doubts is faith that what God says will come to pass. Take it or leave it. I got nothing else for you. Take it or leave it. Simple faith that what God has said will come to pass. Secondly, by faith, we can rejoice in the countless blessings of God. We can be this. We can be this. Grateful. God would provide this couple with a son. His name would be Isaac. And from this one son, didn't give him 10 sons, from this one son, untold millions of people, even on the planet today, descend from him. Millions of people. Maybe some of you are among them. Maybe Isaac is your great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy. Millions of people descend from him. Verse 12, therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, how would you like to be called? If you're an older guy in the room, how many of you like to be referred to that way? Like you're as good as dead. Abraham, I think, go on to live another 75 years or something. In him as good as dead were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, you shouldn't get out your calculator and start running the math. That's not the point. Well, are there actually as many Jewish people on the planet as there are grains of sand on the beach? Obviously not. The point is that God's blessings will be so rich that they will be beyond our ability to count them. You and I have been so blessed that we've forgotten most of God's blessings. It's true. We've forgotten most of them. Thanksgiving should be among one of the most exciting holidays or commemorations that we could and the easiest, I would say, holiday to celebrate. Because in the area of Thanksgiving, if we all got out a piece of pen and paper and started to write out a list of what God has done, you would need pads and pads and pads of paper and a whole lot of ink to write out all of God's blessings. By the way, you should probably try that as a spiritual exercise at some point. Just get out a piece of paper and start writing out the little, the medium-sized, and the big blessings that God has given to you. I think you'll be quite encouraged by it. God's ability to do for this couple who were too old to have kids. Also, this is an added thing. This tips us off to why God often allows us to suffer. Because you should probably be thinking to yourself, well, why would God make them wait for so long? Like, why not give him Isaac at the age of, 25 and 30 or something? Why did God make them wait for so long? Is God kind of like a little bit mean? He kind of gets a little bit of a kick out of people squirming and feeling uncomfortable. Was he getting some sort of a joyful glee out of the fact that Sarah had probably shed bucket loads of tears throughout her younger years because she couldn't have a child? Is that how God operates? Maybe you've had that thought cross your own mind. I know he's sovereign, but why are you permitting this, Lord? Why have you permitting my tear ducts to be in overdrive all the time? And this narrative tips us off to why God permits us to suffer. You see, God at times permits us to go through trying times to push us into a field of ministry or into a level of spiritual growth that we otherwise wouldn't have enjoyed. So think about this for a moment. It's a fact that couples who are infertile are more likely to adopt. It's a fact. Couples that are infertile are more likely to adopt, and there's a whole lot of babies in the world that need to be adopted. Why would God not allow every single couple to have babies? Because babies need to be adopted. Because other children need mentors that married couples with children would not have time to give. From single parent homes, from broken homes, from abusive homes. It's a fact that bereaved people offer the best counsel to those who have been bereaved. When I was in college, I remember saying to one of my professors, I was at 2 funerals for my grandparents in the late 70s. I never went to a single funeral in the 1980s. This was like the early 90s now. I didn't know anybody that had died. He's like, you have to start attending funerals. If you're going to minister to people in their need, if you're going to have any sense of how to minister to the bereaved, you need to get around dead people and their family members. And then since then, of course, I had a brother-in-law that hung himself. I had to preach his funeral. So I'm familiar with death. But if I was completely unfamiliar with death, if God had protected me from death and bereavement, it would be frankly much more theoretical in the hospital or much more theoretical in the funeral parlor to minister to people. But when you experience death, you have a sense of what it's like to go through painful circumstances. And we could go on and on and on. The dark times of life on the other side of the tunnel, when we come through the tunnel, it's like, okay, I did not like that tunnel at all. I would never want to go back into that tunnel. But on the other side of it, I think I understand why God permitted it. Because it shaped me and changed me into the image of his son a little bit more and enabled me to minister to people differently. It's true that an impoverished person will become more generous when God provides for them. I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to grow up in a home where we did not have lunch day after day after day, where I had to leave my school and go out in the parking lot and hope that my mom would show up with a peanut butter sandwich and a cookie. I know what it's like to eat oatmeal for breakfast, for lunch, and for supper. I know that. I know how embarrassing it was at Christmas to go out into the parking lot and have some well-meaning Christian say, hey, come on over here. We got some Christmas presents for you and your brothers and sisters. Now, by comparison, I'm pretty wealthy today. We're probably middle upper class, but I know what it's like to be poor. And I didn't like it, but I'm grateful for it. It's made me more generous. It's made me more appreciative. It has enabled me it was embarrassing when I was a child. But you see, brothers and sisters, God uses our pain, our difficult times to shape us into the image of his son and to enable us to minister to other people. That is why God permitted Sarah to be infertile for 90 years. And that is why I believe God has allowed many of us to suffer in ways that are not because of our own foolishness, but he's allowed us to go through trials and suffering and difficulty because in our pain, we become more loving. We become more attentive. We become more relatable. We become more aware. We become more prayerful. And that is one of the reasons why God allows us to suffer. Remember this, oftentimes when God takes from us, it's because eventually he wants to give us more. Oftentimes when God takes from us, he does it because eventually he wants to give us more. When God withholds, he does so to ultimately prove his provisionary power and to cause us to rely upon him. You know what it's like. When you are healthy, when you have everything you need, you become less prayerful. Isn't it true? Marriage is great. Kids are doing fine. Money in the bank, whatever. But when suddenly something is taken from you, your peace, your security, this is why I think from a spiritual perspective, the erosion of freedoms, the tyranny, the rise of the totalitarian state in the West is causing more and more people to return to church. And more people are getting saved, and I'm thankful for that. And even though we speak out against evil, we know that God, what Satan determined for the bad, God determines for the good. And so we can exercise faith in him, even when we don't know. When we exercise faith in our deepest trials, we are perfectly, think about this, when we exercise faith in our deepest trials, we are perfectly positioned to witness God's amazing provisionary power firsthand. Not just to read about it in some book about some saint that lived 500 years ago, but to experience it in our own lives. But here's the thing. When God provides, he does not always provide immediately. He often provides for us in down payments, in installments. And we often have to wait for the fullest fulfillment that God has in store for us for quite some time. So here's the third lesson about faith from Sarah. By faith, we look forward to our eternal home. Verse 13, these all died in faith. So who are these? So everybody we've talked about so far, but especially Abraham and Sarah. Not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. And having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Having acknowledged that this world is not our final stop. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. In other words, if they look back, it would have made more sense for Abraham and Sarah to go back to the Fertile Crescent, to Mesopotamia. Let's just go back to Dad. He's got a pretty good gig going on. We left wealthy. We could probably build our wealth there. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, here's where the Hebrew writers fills in the gap for us and takes us to the next level, which in the Genesis 18 event wouldn't have been fully obvious. A heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Abraham went to the promised land and he set foot on it. And he bought a grave for Sarah. And that's it. He didn't conquer it. He didn't chase out the Canaanites. He didn't fully possess it. Imagine you're a young person and you're looking for a house. I know many of you are. You're looking for a house and the prices just seem like out of reach. And so your dad comes and says, hey, I'm gonna buy you a house. You need a house? I'm gonna buy you a house. So start attending open houses. And you go to attend these open houses and you're in there and you're like, oh, I like this house. Okay, Dad, we found the right house. He's like, great. I will buy it for your great grandson. But what I want you to do for the rest of your life is just attend open houses in faith that I will eventually purchase it for one of your descendants. You'd be like, this is a ripoff. But that was Abraham's scenario. Go attend the open house. walk from the top to the bottom of the country, from the east to the west. I'll let you have a little bit of a taste of it, but ultimately the fulfillment you're waiting will not be made available to you until post-Exodus. And that imagery is transferred in the New Testament context to helping us to understand the difference between God's provision and God's promises now versus the final and full fulfillment of those promises in heaven. Abraham and Sarah saw the promised son, Isaac, but they did not see the promised son, Christ, who would be the ultimate seed who would descend from Abraham and Sarah's body. And they, of course, did not see all of their physical descendants. They probably met Jacob and Esau. If you run the numbers, Jacob and Esau would have been around 15-ish or so when Abraham died. Sarah probably never met them, but chances are Abraham would have met the next generation down, but they certainly did not see the nation. They certainly did not see their descendants building homes in the promised land, but they saw God beginning to fulfill his plans, installment by installment. Okay, first Isaac, then Jacob and Esau, then a little piece of real estate to bury your wife, and then just trust me for the rest. Trust me for the rest. And that should be enough for our faith as well. If you have a little down payment, if you have a little foretaste, if you have a little proof that God has provided for you so far, that should be enough to sustain you till God's eternal heavenly kingdom. Now you'll notice that there's a reference to a city here that ties back into the previous passage about the city whose designer and builder is God. And the writer of Hebrews sees beyond the physical blessings of Jerusalem and sees the ultimate fulfillment of those blessings in the heavenly city, which we can read more about in John's eschatological vision of the new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem recorded for us in Revelation 21. In Revelation 21, verses 1 and 2, I'll read that to you. The Bible says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." We could say a new Canaan, a new promised land. "For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more," the sea being a place of chaos and fear for the land-loving Israelite. "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband," which you would all admit is a beautiful image in and of itself. So the writer of Hebrews is pointing to that, and then John gives us a little more detail and reminds us that one day the old order of things will be made new. One day God will fully, completely deal with the trials, the temptations, the sin, the brokenness. And so while we rightly should get angry at sin, we do not fall into despair. While we should be saddened by death, we do not fall into despair. Despair, and I've experienced it in my own life, and it's a sin. Despair is a failure to acknowledge and or appropriate the resurrection power of Christ. We need to name it. That's the problem. When we take our eyes off of Christ, his power to transform, to make all things new, faithlessness is what fills the gap. So brothers and sisters, let's be reminded what it means to walk by faith. Faithless people, all they have to look forward to is fear and death. That's all they have to look forward to. More fear and more death. But people of faith have something to look forward to that transcends the present. And so when we jump off the railing into our Father's arms, we can be absolutely assured that he will never stand aside and cause us to be injured. He loves us, he cares for us, and he will always catch us. So trust in him. Put your faith in him, where there is comfort and life and hope and meaning. May you be encouraged by these words.